Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with E.C. Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the distinct privilege of presenting E.C. with a question on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, we aim to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. And how are you doing, EC?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. We're going to talk about an article on CNN that I sent you recently that I wanted to get your take on. And as it turns out, there was an episode inside of it. So it's a conversation about what CNN dubbed the best diet of 2021. So that's what we're going to dive into. That's what we're going to talk about today. Before we do, though, we mentioned this in the last episode. You've got something new. You've got a corporate wellness program that you're launching, that you're rolling out. Why don't you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's essentially the materials that I've used for the hundreds of gyms that have used it, also other corporate wellness clients already. But the 800-gram challenge is perfect for a corporate wellness program, right? It's super inclusive. It's super simple. And so now, I've just kind of upgraded platforms that I use for that. And so if people are interested, they can contact me at info@optimizemenutrition.com for all of the pricing and details for that program.
Is there a certain kind of business corporation that something like this would fit well into? You know, a 1,000-person business, or
Sure.
would it work, or would you imagine it working well in a 5 to 10 kind of small business type environment?
You know, the corporate challenges that I've done so far have not been as large as 1,000 plus, but I certainly see the application there for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, again, this challenge is inclusive. We're not weighing and measuring everything. We're talking about eating fruits and vegetables. So I really do think that it can scale quite well, and the platform and myself can have resources to do that. But yeah, most of the organizations so far have been a little bit on the smaller scale, more on the 100 type of person range.
Mm-hmm.
And then they tend to have some sort of part about their culture that has fitness in it already, right?
Cool.
And that's probably because of some of my prior connections. But again, I think this idea is pretty mainstream. So I'm happy to expand that out.
And you said info at Optimize Me Nutrition to reach out and get details. Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to talk about this article. Best diet of the year for 2021. And I'll spoil it for folks. It was the Mediterranean diet again. I'm just going to read the first little 2 sentences just so to get people in, and we'll link to the whole thing. It's very short. It's a CNN article, so it's not like we're going deep here. It says, the gold medal for best 2021 diet went to the Mediterranean diet for the 4th year in a row, according to rankings announced by the U.S. News and World Report. Tied for silver was the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, and the Flexitarian diet, which I had never heard of before, which encourages being a vegetarian most of the time, but is flexible enough to allow a burger now and then. So first thing first, I had really sent it to you partly as a joke, partly as kind of a little bit of cynical, me being cynical. But as it turns out, there was actually, I don't know if I want to use the word impressed, but you were not unimpressed by the article itself. So let's go kind of first high level initial thoughts of this article, and then we'll kind of dive into the specifics from there.
Yeah. I mean, when you texted me the article, I was sort of like, I mean, a whole podcast episode on this. It's pretty good, right? I mean, they're this moderate approach. They're telling people to eat Mediterranean diet. I was like, this is great. We have no outlandish claims. I was like, I guess we can just sort of say good job, CNN,
Yeah.
And so that was sort of my initial first take. And I think your point was a little more cynical, and I'd like you to kind of explain that. But it does bring up this idea, once you kind of push back on that, it's like, is there really all this ever-changing research, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I was responding quite a bit just to the headline, which is, a problem in and of itself, just reading headlines. But what I was responding to, and what was curious about your take on, is just this notion of, do we really need a best diet of the year? Like, as if it's the new iPhone, or it's, like, why are we creating a competition here that seems to change every year, when a lot of what we've talked about on the show, a lot of what you talk about hasn't changed at all, right? And so there's that dichotomy to me of, why is this a competition? And then I was also like, why does the Mediterranean diet keep winning this competition?
Right.
But really it was this notion of like, is the research changing so much that every year we've got to sit down and say, who's the winner this year?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's just a really great point. And this cacophony in the media about like, oh my God, there's so much research and all the nutrition stuff is moving at this fast pace. And, there are new ideas out there, right? Like, I push the 800-gram challenge as a different diet approach. And of course, I have my reasons and biases for that. But the important distinction there is diets are trying to approximate physiological truths. And our physiology, the underlying physiology, just isn't changing that fast. And I mean, you said like the Mediterranean diet won again, right? I mean, CNN could just save this article and republish it every January 1st, for the next 20 years, just updating the year in the title. And it's got this catchy headline, like best diet of the year, implying that they've got some newfound secret. And then the content is like, yeah, eat a diverse array of whole unprocessed foods and don't eat so much of the processed stuff, avoid the extreme stuff that doesn't work so well. So I really do love that they aren't pushing this extreme approach. But that underlying physiology that isn't changing is the fact that we need these specific nutrients. We need a certain amount of protein. We need a certain amount of fat, carbs, depending on your goals, vitamins, minerals, in quantities to match our overall needs and goals. And it turns out the best way to do that is with these non-extreme approaches that are centered around whole foods. And this is why my main message in nutrition is the principles. We can keep going round and round on these different diet approaches. And sure, there are nuances. Maybe it's the 800-gram challenge. Maybe it's lazy macros. Maybe it's the Mediterranean. But these diets are really like changing window dressings. They're superficial changes. They're not substantive changes. And, that's what causes a lot of this confusion until you see why the Mediterranean diet is incredibly similar to paleo, lazy macros, flexitarian. It will forever appear like there's so much changing in nutrition.
Yeah, it seems to suffer from a kind of ADD that we all seem to suffer from, or at least that the internet seems to want us to suffer from to a degree, right? That's just the idea of like, it's saying the same thing probably that it said last year, but it has to say it in a way that makes you think it's new, so that now you'll pay attention to it because the internet is all about novelty, right? And if you can't say, the title of the article can't be "Nothing new has changed in nutrition." Nobody's going to click on that, right? And so but it's interesting that what the article has, or what you kind of responding to, is actually that it's kind of tricking people into an article about, oh yeah, it's the same, guys, just continue eating fruit and vegetables.
Totally.
You did say something in there though, or at least maybe implied in there is this idea of this notion that the research is always changing. And that's maybe why, oh yeah, it makes sense that every year we revisit which diets are the most whatever, the most effective, the most popular, whatever. And so I think for me, is that even true from your research, from what you see? Is the research changing? Even if maybe the end result, the advice that research kind of spits out is the same, is the research in fact actually changing?
I don't really think it is. I mean, when people are like, oh, the research is always changing, there's so much research, all this stuff, it's like, well, sort of. And I really think there's three issues to bring up when people talk about this idea of like, it's moving at such a fast pace and we need a best new diet of 2021. And those three issues are, what is truly original research? We have to also look at sample size of that original research. And then finally, reproducibility of that original research. So the first one about original research, there really isn't a ton of original research when you're looking at humans. And the reason why is it's expensive and it's hard to do.
Yeah.
And, you don't really totally appreciate this until you go and you do this as an exercise yourself. But for example, there's PubMed. That's the search engine for all the peer-reviewed scientific papers, right?
Google for nerds.
Yeah, it's nerd blogs. But, in preparing for this podcast, just an example, I searched the term fasting, which is, of course, is a popular topic. And I searched from the date ranges from 2014 to 2020. And in response to just that term, I had over 43,000 results. So at first it's like, oh my God, there is so much research in terms of fasting, right? There's no chance in hell someone's going to get through that. Now, when you take that 43,000 plus number of papers and when you try to whittle that down to what was the actual number of studies, what were the people, where were the papers of the people actually running the experiments and actually running the experiments in humans? That 43,000 plus goes down to 23. And actually, Adifer in 2020 is the one who kind of has culled this together most recently. But let's say they missed a couple just because, they're not necessarily perfect. We're all humans, right? Maybe they missed a few studies. Great. So maybe there's 30 out there, right? So there's maybe 30 original research studies of humans with fasting out of 43,000 plus results about fasting. And again, that means original research, the people actually running the experiment with humans. So it begs the question then of like, well, what makes up all of those other 43,000 results, right? Like, holy cats, what is that? Lots of different things. First of all, animal studies is going to be a big one. There's also plenty of summaries about existing research and then opinions about that existing research. So, scientists or people that are qualified in the area, they will then put together a paper that says, okay, well, these animal studies found this, and this is what I think is happening on a molecular level. And so this is the flow of molecules, and this is why it's happening. That's what a lot of their papers are. It's people opining about what's happening. And look, I'm not against that. I mean, that helps us understand what's going on and put the picture together. But when we actually want to say proving and what we know on a human level that's going to play out in real time, we have to go back to the original research. And when you do that exercise, when you actually take a paper that's about fasting and you see what they cite about what happened with people with fasting and you go to find that article, you have to go down multiple layers. A lot of times you'll find that studies are cited on top of studies, and it takes you down to a very few number of studies. And the reason, again, is because human research is very expensive and hard to do.
A couple things, maybe, before we move on to the second of the three that you mentioned. One, I imagine there still is, because they're being done so often, the value of animal studies or studies in mice. I imagine that we're still learning quite a bit from there, but that maybe there's still... that's not the gold standard that we actually want to look at. Is that true?
Yeah, my studies are great. Animal studies are great. They're not the gold standard, but they're phenomenal because one, we can go through life cycles quite quickly, right? We can't go through human life cycles quite as fast. Yep. So there's a time that's reduced there. We can also do things with animals that we can't do with humans, i.e. control all of their diet for their entire life. So this is a great way that people can test out mechanisms and see, okay, I think this is what's happening at the cellular level, or I think this is toxic, or I think this helps them lose weight. They can test that on mice as like a first step. If it doesn't pass the mice standard, then we're not going to go to the more expensive human phase. So there's for sure value there, but you would not want to get a result from a mice study and be like, this is how I'm living my life, because it's just not representative of all of the other factors that come into play once we're looking at humans.
Yeah. The other question I had is, you had mentioned that many of these studies are folks looking at the few studies that there may be, and then I think you said opining on maybe what's happening there or what they think is happening. When that's happening, are people making hypotheses based on that research, or are they literally just explaining what's going on? Because we already know, and now it just takes an expert in a certain field to lay it out for us. Yeah,
both actually. And this is why scientific articles are generally separated into sections, and where the discussion is where we see more of their opinions, and then kind of the research is where we see more of the findings.
Got it.
And it's very easy to take a point out of a discussion paper that looks scientific with a title and is peer reviewed and then say, therefore it is fact, right? But you have to go back kind of to what the actual data found. And I will also say scientists are generally more cautious than news media headlines, right? So a lot of times, even when a scientist is making opinion, they will say something like, as all of the articles do, they'll say more research is needed, because they know that they don't really have the full picture. But then when you want to go post it on social media or wherever, a mainstream news article, it typically gets a little bit simplified because, one, you have to make it a little more digestible, and two, clickable.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. So that was original research. The next one, I think you said, was sample size.
Totally. Yeah. So great. So let's say that we get down to this number of whatever original research articles. Then one of the problems there is, what's the actual sample size? Like, if you're going to draw these conclusions for the entire, US population, world population, whatever, you better hope to have a lot of people that you're basing that on. And as an example, in the muscle protein synthesis podcast, when I got down to the number of studies where we were actually doing, they were actually doing original research and looking at, okay, we gave the people the protein, what happened? I found like 3 studies and maybe I missed some, sure. So maybe there's 5 or 6, but these studies are like, 30, 50 people. So, I mean, even there, then we have this issue of, okay, well, now are we going to make a claim for everyone in the US based on a total sample size of like 600 people? Yeah. As a great example in our current climate with the COVID vaccine, I mean, I think they had to get results on over 30,000 people before being able to like release to the public, right? I mean, we need a way larger scale than what a lot of these studies are.
Yeah. One of the criticisms that I hear often of studies, maybe it's nutrition, but maybe it's even broader, is that oftentimes the people being studied are 22-year-old college students because it's the only group of people who will be willing to do something for, $7 and some nachos.
Totally.
At the end of it. Is that also an issue? Not only just the sample size, but also I'm sure that there's a term for that, but the sample diversity.
Of course. Yeah. What that sample represents. And totally. And we actually touched on that in that same podcast, the muscle protein synthesis podcast, and because it was like looking at people that were already resistance training and already eating a certain level of protein, right? And once you want to go to like a population that's never done resistance training or is eating a very low amount of protein, okay, that's a different context, right?
Yeah.
That's a different context. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So the last point was reproducibility, the ability to, I imagine that this is what this means is, okay, I see the study that you did, I'm going to do it myself and I'm going to get the same result that you got.
Totally. And this is a big problem with, again, the research, because not a single study can prove anything. We need those results to be verified by another independent lab. Why? Well, errors happen, biases happen, sample size is a problem, right? So we want to see that other people can get the same results. And again, in the muscle protein synthesis podcast, when I got down to those 3 kind of relevant studies, we found that they had different intakes resulted in maximal rates of synthesis, and those actual rates of synthesis were different. So now we're down to 3 studies of smaller sample size with different actual findings. So to figure out, quote, what's right, I mean, you have to take into all those considerations, but really you have to look across the body of research that's relevant and be like, okay, what are the themes here? And this is one of the big problems with published research is that the finding doesn't have to be replicated to be published. So a study with a new finding can be published. It might get a lot of attention, like protein shakes, develop muscle protein synthesis, but nobody can repeat it. That's a problem. And so you do want to find ultimately that this finding was repeated before you go out and say, okay, this is how we all should live our life, right? And so this is what ideally that we try to do with our opinions is you go back to the actual studies, find the ones that were done with humans, look across to see, what was the sample size or what was the relevant sample population and was it reproduced? And then we might have a conclusion to move forward with. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. I mean, it really, I think, comes down to incentives to a large degree. But if you are running a news site, then what you just described probably isn't going to get the clicks necessary to get the ads necessary, blah, 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 right? And so where does that leave plebeians like myself who aren't going to dive into PubMed? That's asking a lot of normal people. I lovingly refer to you as not normal.
Oh, well, thank you.
At least as good when it comes to nutrition.
Okay, I was going to say. Yeah, no, I think you're 100% correct. I mean, for the lay person, I think that is unrealistic, right? And, I think what's important to understand is that I think there is a lot changing for the lay person in the sense of there are more opinions and experts and websites and influencers. So that space is very loud and changing, but I don't really necessarily think the underlying research is changing quite as fast. And to be clear, I'm part of that loud space. I'm part of that cacophony of media and opinions, right? I'm not just saying that everyone else is doing it wrong except for me. I constantly think about whether or not I'm just adding to the noise. But I think this is just an imperfect system for how everybody learns things that aren't at the expert level, right? We've got the actual studies in the labs. Those people certainly aren't on Instagram. They're experts and influencers giving their opinion on the science. These experts and influencers are humans that are advancing their own knowledge and understanding. They have the right to get things wrong at times. They're never always going to be perfect. And I really just see it as a kind of this large unwieldy game of telephone, unfortunately. And I don't know that I have the solution. I think it is unrealistic for everyone to track on all these topics. I mean, sometimes these podcasts takes me hours to put together to really get down to the, 3 original studies. Yeah. And I do think, I hope, I wish, if you were referencing kind of like the CNN and their massive influence, that the people with influence increase their diligence as their influence increases, right? If you're going to claim that you've done the reading on a topic and you have a good amount of influence, I would hope that means you've done the reading on PubMed, not blogs and books and other news articles. And so and again, nobody can be expected to be perfect and get everything right, even in doing that. But I would like to see that effort is there, and I think that's actually what I really liked about this CNN article, right? Like, I'm assuming the writer didn't go to PubMed and read about the Mediterranean diet, but what was the conclusion that they ultimately pushed, right? They've got a massive influence on that article, and they ended up saying, eat mostly whole unprocessed foods and don't be too restrictive, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, this is very much an imperfect system working with imperfect people.
one of my impossible questions
Yeah.
that I like to throw to you, which is, if you had to say plus or minus, pro or con, we've talked about the internet and influencers and blogs and all of these things, net plus for us collectively in pursuit of health, or a net negative for us in our pursuit of health?
I ultimately side on net plus, probably because it's, afforded me my career, right? It's what's given me the opportunity to do that. But I do think there is a concern with having all opinions out of one voice, right? And that means that ultimately now we have a lot of opinions, and not maybe all opinions are good opinions, but I do think there's a greater strength there than solidifying the voice. Yeah.
Okay. Given all that, what advice do you have for regular folk? How do we make better decisions? Ultimately, that's what we're talking about. That's what it needs to come back down to, is what are we actually doing on a day-to-day basis?
Totally.
How do we navigate all this stuff? How do we make sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a couple ideas, again, imperfect ideas, but I do think a little bit of healthy skepticism is good. I mean, did we really get to 2021, and it's this exact time in human history that we learned the one food or the one supplement is what's killing everyone, right?
Yep.
And I hate to say it, but your favorite blogger is not on the forefront of research. And I am right there with that group, right? Yep. I am not on the forefront of research. I mean, true medical breakthroughs and understanding like physiological mechanisms, that is not me, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, I might explain things a little differently. My voice might resonate with some people, and I have maybe a different way to phrase things. But at the end of the day, even my 800-gram challenge, as much as I love it, we're talking about eating fruits and veggies, right? So just be aware of that I don't think our mainstream influencers is really where, the breakthrough knowledge is happening. And so a simple reality check on some of those sensationalist pieces can be good. And it would have served me quite well years ago. Like, am I really dying from the beans? So be wary of that, like everything you thought you knew was wrong, type of mentality.
Yep.
I think the other one that I would go with is just be wary of like the hyper specific advice of like, this is exactly what you need to do. And I thought about not saying that, because I can already hear sort of the criticism of it. Like, well, wait a minute, you recommend the 800-gram challenge and 0.7 protein as, what people should do. And you kind of say that broadly to everybody. And you're right. And that is true. I will say there's a good amount of flexibility still with those guidelines, but still, yes, I do recommend those. But again, we have to draw this distinction between kind of the principles and the methods, and that my main message is the 10 principles. My main message is not 800-gram challenge and lazy macros, so much as I love them. My main message is I don't actually want to tell you what to do. I have very little interest in doing that. I want to tell you what to eat to get what you want. I want to tell you how you can get the goals that you want, and then you decide if you want to do that. It just turns out that's a really unwieldy conversation to get someone going on their diet. Like, think about it. You have this new person. They just want to get started on eating healthy. What am I going to do? Pull over the whiteboard and like go through the 10 principles? Meanwhile, none of them even list a single food. I mean, it's just a little out of touch with reality and what people need in the moment. And there was a guest on Joe Rogan, and I wish I remembered who it was, but I just loved the quote. He was talking about the fact that you can't be interesting and right. So, like to go through these exact mechanisms of molecular biology, I mean, people are not generally interested. The eyes are going to glaze over. You're not going to get them to buy into your diet. How do you do that? You have to make it more accessible. You have to make it more interesting. And that is what I try to do with the 800-gram challenge and lazy macros. But at the end of the day, that's not truly the full expression of my message. And ultimately, my approach and the way that I go about my advice is imperfect as well.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I've got a friend he's a longtime gym owner and coach, really smart guy. And what he tries to be, or kind of the phrase he came up with in terms of what he's trying to be is trying to be a guide and not a guru, right? Stay away from gurus, but find the guides. And I think that that's something that we can do really well. I think I would consider you a guide in understanding nutrition better. But like you said, you're not saying do this thing or else you're gonna die early, whatever, right?
Right.
And I think that that's where we fall into some trouble sometimes, where we find and fall into the trap of looking for gurus when really what we should be doing is looking for guides. That's with nutrition. That can be really across any category of life, whether it's finances or fitness or health or business or whatever. It's easy to find gurus because they make us think that, okay, well, he has the answers or she has the answers and I just have to do what she says. When kind of to your point is we all have like 60% of the truth.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you've got to do a good job of figuring, okay, that what part of that is relevant to me is real. And let me take that and let me be the author of my own life to a degree and not just, okay, tell me what to do. And that's where we run into trouble is, please tell me what to do, because ultimately that will never work.
Yeah, and I've got a post, and maybe this will be a podcast at some point, but I think there's a really interesting distinction with nutrition. I do think there are some things in your life you can truly outsource. Taxes, which is a great one for me. I would like to spend as least time as possible on that, and there are experts who can do that way better than I. Yeah. And I truly can outsource that. I don't know, construction on your house, right? Like there are things you can truly outsource. I don't think nutrition is one of them. Because it's a constant, because it's something that's part of your life every day. It's available 24/7 if you really want it to be. And so I don't think it's something you can truly outsource. And so by finding a guide, you ultimately are going to kind of come to your optimal endpoint, your optimize me endpoint faster than a guru. Yeah.
It's also how you can cut through a lot of the noise and the clutter of all of these influencers, all of these blogs, all of these ideas, all of these diets is to be really intentional about, okay, when it comes to nutrition, I'm going to pay attention to what EC is saying, and I'm going to pay attention to, I'm just going to Chris Kresser, right? Yeah. These are the two people who I respond to, who seem to see the world the same way that I do, whose advice I understand, whose presentation resonates with me, and almost everything else, I'm just going to be like, that's going to be background noise. And if it's important, EC or Chris, it's going to bubble up in what they say, and I'm going to get it, right? And if they don't, then I trust that it's not important. Right. It's not. So I'm going to be able to ignore all of the other shiny objects, all of the new diets, all of the new things.
Totally.
Until the two people who I trust, the two people who I've done a good job of curating for myself say, hey guys, this is important, or this is what I think about this. And then I can dive into it.
Totally. And I think that goes back to your kind of point about like, which is better, and why I think there's strength in having more people have voices. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So all of this being said, what is changing? I'm really curious. We've said the research isn't changing that much.
Yeah.
But it's got to be changing to some, it's science, right? Like science, it's a slow climb, but it is a climb. And so in your mind, in your research and what you pay attention to, what do you see is actually changing as it relates to our understanding of nutrition, our understanding of our own health?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I kind of got a similar question the other day, and I just really like it. Like, what do I think is going to be big in 10 years? They use the
self-driving cars. Is that relevant?
Yeah, that probably. And they mentioned kind of the gut microbiome as a good example. And I think it was a great example because it's like, yeah, there's way more attention on that now than there ever was before. But what I think changes the most is not necessarily what we actually do in day-to-day practice. I think what changes is our understanding of why that day-to-day practice is important. Like I actually see science for the most part trying to catch up with what we already know works well in application. We see things in real time, and then science is really trying to figure out why they're occurring. And the gut microbiome is a great example of that. We've learned over these years that, for example, that people who have obesity tend to have different microbial species in their gut microbiota compared to normal weight individuals. And we've also learned that different fiber types and different foods can affect those populations. And when you think about that, you're like, oh, wow, that's great. We've learned so much. We know so much more. But at the end of the day, do we? At the end of the day, we know that we need to cut down on the processed stuff, not eat too much, and eat that diverse array of fruits and vegetables. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess now we know that, people's health who have obesity, that's being affected by the excess calories in their diet and also affected by the changing microbiome population. But I don't know, again, that really changes the practice that we would recommend to them. And I like then thinking about, okay, well, let's go back to those blue zone populations, right? The people who live to 100 plus with ease. Like, were they taking microbiome samples, like were they doing regular stool samples each year to chart their progress of species diversity? No, they weren't. And I understand, I understand that maybe the argument is, well, they could be better off if they did. But the funny thing is they're crushing us in the health and longevity game, right? They're hitting 100 easy and we're getting to 76 with comorbidities. So it's just sort of like, I don't know that really much is changing. I think it's still going to keep coming back to these basics that work really well in application, have already proved out, and we'll just understand why that is the case better.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay. Coming back to the article a little bit, maybe start to wrap this conversation up. Big key takeaways. It seems that you're at least favorable to the way they presented this information. Anything worth mentioning, any limitations worth mentioning before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, definitely overall, I think it's great. I love the fact that they kind of are pushing a Mediterranean diet, eat a whole unprocessed foods. Awesome. To nitpick, I do think there's a couple limitations besides the headline, but I do think there's a little bit of, for the reader, of like, okay, what to do now? And in their defense, they list the foods of the Mediterranean diet and they give these different ideas and they suggest, for example, this is their, what to do for the person, the layperson. It's like, get started one meal a week that focuses on beans, whole grains, and vegetables.
Yep.
And I like it. I mean, we have to start small. I get that they're not just pushing this idea of perfection, but, we talked about the concepts of pressure and dose in the Why It's Okay to Be Hungry podcast. And I'm going to tell you this suggestion isn't enough pressure. A dinner once a week without any other changes any other days of the week, I don't know. It's just, they eat the bean dinner and then they go on to have the pint of ice cream or something like that. Like, it's just not enough change. People aren't going to see these results and be like, wow, that CNN article really helped me out, right? Yep. And so this is where I do have bias towards the 800-gram challenge, because there's this measurable number to hit, and that's a large enough number where we have enough pressure that the dose will accumulate more quickly. So that's kind of the first nitpick. The second nitpick is that, they recommend getting started on like a bean dinner. I mean, I love beans, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's a hard sell to be like, take someone who's on the standard American diet and be like, you're going to start this week with the bean quinoa, perfect Mediterranean diet. And again, this is where my biases are showing through, but this is why I like something like the 800-gram challenge. I mean, if I can get that person started on strawberries and pineapple, I mean, let's not worry about the bean dinner. And I see that a lot with a lot of these like meal prep tip stuff. And it's like, they give these diets that are just, straight carrots and kidney beans. And it's just like, I mean, I love them, but let's let the user have some autonomy and buy-in before we get to the hyper specifics. But overall, I really shouldn't be nitpicking because it's a good overall message.
All right, cool. I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation about the best diet in the history of the universe until next year.
Yes.
Awesome. Anything else to wrap this conversation up? Anything else worth mentioning before we say farewell?
Well, as you know, Patrick, my email list gets bonus content. So this article did mention Keto 2.0. So I'm going to talk about that.
I was actually curious about that.
I'm going to talk about that. So they can join at optimizemeenutrition.com/email.
Awesome. And one more reminder, one more plug for your corporate wellness program. Yes. If folks want to learn more, info at optimizemeenutrition.com. And EC will get back to you and she will tell you all about the goodness. All right, EC, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody out there listening. Thank you to those who leave ratings and reviews. They do certainly help more people find the show. So if you like the show, share it with some friends and leave us a rating. And we'll see everybody again soon on another episode of The Consistency Project.